So thanks everybody for joining us tonight. Another virtual tasting with Binny's. I think we're on Facebook already. I don't know. Alicia, do you see it? Whatever. Sorry, Facebook. No one wants you anymore anyway. All right, so we're going to talk about not distilled spirits today. So this is very much outside my personal area of expertise. I enjoy tasting these things, but I have no idea what the hell I'm talking about. So that's why we have Jake here, of course, and Dan. We are joined by our friend Mike Cush today as well. Mike is sometimes found at Binny's, but sometimes making wine in various locations in the world. So Mike's joining us from New Zealand, where it's tomorrow afternoon. Ooh, time travel. So thank you, Mike, for joining us tonight. I guess, Jake, where do you want to start tonight? Because we've got a bunch of different things we're going to talk about.
Yeah, no, good evening, everyone, and welcome back to week 5 of this excitement. Today, I think it's very appropriate that we're on the whiskey hotline or with the whiskey hotline today, because today we're going to talk about time, air, and wood as much as we're going to talk about grapes and how those interactions create, along with a great deal of different traditions, as well as some common market forces, create a real incredible diversity of what we sometimes call funny old wines. But
well, that's why we brought a Portuguese winemaker to bear.
That's right.
So
my pronunciation skills isn't necessarily my strength, but I'll do my best.
Yeah. Don't worry. There's only one Castelao in here.
Well, that's a favorite one.
No Robert de Value or anything like that. But so yeah, it'd be great to have both Mike and Dan on. They've actually made wine, so that's rather handy. I'll be able to talk about history and tradition and what these wines sort of taste like, and but the hardcore tech questions can go to them. But the title of this is "Gimme Some Air," because oxidation and oxidative character is a critical part of all the wines we're going to taste tonight in varying degrees, and we'll try to get to how the air and the wine interact in different ways with the different wines we're going to taste. We got 6 wines we're going to talk about. It will take some time, at least when we talk about our first category, which is Madeira. But first, a little bit about this guy here, Sodalone Selections. This is a side of our business devoted to these kind of wines, and here are some of our producers. And the enormous plate of ham in the bottom left of the screen is absolutely there on it for a reason. These are all producers, mainly in Catalonia and in Portugal, although the bottom left is Alagna down in Sicily, Marsala. These are producers that are preserving things that basically no one cared about. No one has cared about for decades. Old traditions of fortified, often fortified, always oxidized or at least partially oxidized wines that represent both home winemaking traditions, but really, if you go back to Roman times, the most exalted of wines. Back in ancient times, before measurable sulfur and refrigeration, there were basically 3 kinds of wines. The first was some form of nouveau, make it, drink it. Very, normal kind of thing, just to basically ferment grapes to make them safe to drink. The second was something we've talked about for several of our sessions together. Those were aromatized wines with, if you think about ancient Greece, you had grapes, you had honey, you had citrus, you had wormwood, you had a certain amount of an apothecary tradition. But with all of those things, you could blend together and make a pretty good vermouth. And that extended the life of grapes, extended the life of wines, even though the wines would take on oxidized characteristics. But the third, the most exalted, were the wines that were put away, initially in clay pots, and then eventually, as we got into more modern times, in wooden barrels. And it was the slow evaporation, concentration, oxidation, and of those wines that made them the wines that were the most prized in family houses. Over time, as wine became a mercantile product, the necessity of adding alcohol for shipping initially, but then to affect flavor and sugar level, became part of how these wines evolved into the modern era. But then then in the 20th century, when the fashion for dry, reductive wines after measurable sulfur and refrigeration became available, these wines have often, in some cases, been lost to the sands of time. So these are the folks who are keeping them alive for you. I'm going to use a few words today, or there's a few words I think you should know to sort of get a sense of the different processes and different characteristics that we're talking about today. First, we called this side of our book Sodalone Selections. Sodalone is a flavor compound. It's some people describe it as the flavor of maple syrup. Some people describe it as the flavor of fenugreek, which is a typical curry spice. It's earthy, it's funky, but it is one of the 3 flavonoids that are the classic hallmarks of oxidation in wine. In the style of wine, style of oxidized wine that we started with this portfolio, which is dry rancio wines from Catalunya, that sodalone characteristic is very prominent. Rancio can mean a lot of different things in the world of drinks. Dan, do you want to talk about rancio as a flavor characteristic in spirits?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's completely different. No, I mean, that's for another day because we have so much to talk about here. But I should say you'll most commonly hear rancio in the context of something like old brandies. It's a character that comes really, essentially through long-term maturation in wood. Really, it must be a minimum of 2 to a few decades to establish it. But that's completely different type of character than the rancios you're speaking about now.
Well, yeah, the specific wines, but just more generally, like what does rancio taste like?
Rancio is something that I would say is marked by the transformation of a spirit. You usually have a very youthful side of things, something that's coming right out of the still, fresh fruit, very pretty. It goes into wood for some period of time, usually some sort of active wood, and then you get these very big woody notes. The third sort of phase of maturation is the integration of those woody notes into the spirit, and then you have something that is harmonious and then goes on to age. But the sort of 4th level is where those notes of wood and those notes of fruit have had enough time with oxygen, with microorganisms, frankly, and that's something for a different day, to completely transform and take on new notes that were not part of the original profile, either within the fruit or within the wood. So notes of oak then transform to things like leather and cedar, and fresh fruit characteristics take on things like dried nuts and dried apricots, if you will, or
Dan is consumed with paroxysms of rancio.
I think he was eventually getting tobacco and maybe mushroom. Some people will say a little bit of mushroom.
So the flavors are all the same when you talk about rancio in spirits versus rancio characteristics in oxidized wine. Sodalone is one of those flavors of rancio. Now in wine with more acid and lower alcohol and more different, a lot of different stuff swimming around in this soup, sometimes those evolutions take a little bit less time, but also producers have ways of forcing it along. Oxidative and oxidized, these are characteristics. Oxidative describes aging in which air is allowed to get in contact with the wine. A wine is considered is said to be oxidative if those characteristics show through when you taste them. Oxidized is taking that farther out. A wine, we sometimes call a wine fully oxidized if the interaction of the wine and the air, mainly through barrels that aren't particularly full, is so much that it renders the wine virtually devoid of what we would call fresh characteristics, and it's all of those tertiary characteristics that become so much more important. The more you oxidize a wine, in general, the longer you can keep the bottle open. And that's a really important point, that oftentimes, and the reason for that is when you open a bottle of wine, the way that it starts getting not as good isn't so much oxidation per se, but the loss of those fresh high aromatics that you get that kind of jump out of the glass. If you think about a beautiful glass of Burgundy or something, If those are gone as part of the production process, there's less to go flat in a wine. Of course, the logical end of that is Madeira, which has forced full oxidation. Those wines can stay open for a very, very long time. Fortification, the adding of spirit to wine to raise its alcohol level. Much like in aromatized wine, that can be used just to kill the bugs, or it can be used very occasionally to add flavor with a non-neutral spirit. But most fortifying spirit in most areas of fortified wine production is neutral, but at different strengths. Mutage is a subset of fortification where the alcohol is added while the wine is fermenting. That kills the yeast that are doing the fermenting and retains a certain amount of residual sugar in the wine. While that's a relatively modern thing, really only dating in some places back 60 or 70 or 80 years, it is pretty much the way virtually all fortified wines that are intended to be sweet are made. Notable exception being Marsala, which is almost always back sweet. Now, if you think about it, that's a lot of theory, but Rancio is in things we love, porcinis and old rum and old brandies and Jura wines and Fino and Manzanilla, cigars, teas. Yeah, these are things we love, and so what's kind of fun about this portfolio for us is it gives us a chance to capture a lot of different things that fit within this realm, and we'll talk about a few of those tonight.
So and maybe weigh in, is Dan back with us?
I don't think so.
Not quite.
Dan, okay, because we had to just hold this question, Jake, and I don't know if you saw it from Facebook. We do have a quick question. John on Facebook, I only get Rancio notes in French brandy since they use grapes high in acidity. Does more acidity contribute to more Rancio notes? So
I'm going to let Dan tackle that one.
Yeah, let Dan or Mike, if you want to talk about wine.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of brand, I mean, the sort of the spirit itself, that'd be difficult for me to comment on. But I mean, certainly, yes, some of these kind of styles of wine that are fortified and have these Rancio type characteristics, these Sotolone sort of characteristics. Madeira is certainly kind of being one. These are, certainly kind of high acid sort of varietals. But if that's necessarily an inherent kind of component that encourages that Rancio sort of character, yeah, I don't necessarily know if that would be true.
Acid can also be another way of stabilizing a wine during production. A little bit of extra acidity means that microorganisms are present everywhere, right? And acidity, if the soup is higher in acidity, then certain microorganisms will be selected over others, which may be considered a good thing. Or they'll have certain impact. Or in the case of flor or voile, the layer of yeast that lives on top of the liquid in a barrel of Fino or a Manzanilla or a traditional Jura wine, it actually interacts with the acidity in a way that kind of rounds it out. Acidity also makes, I think, provides some pep in these wines, which have a lot of kind of crazy earthy flavors, and it makes them go better with food. So part of this is you could very well make a Rancio or a heavily oxidized wine from something that's lower in acid, but it might not be delicious, and it might not still exist. So today we're going to talk about 4 categories: the first 2 from Portugal, and the last 2 from the French part of Catalonia in the Roussillon. Madeira is a fortified wine. It's heated during maturation, either very slowly or more quickly. Heated to full oxidation, made from grapes that are slightly underripe, can be white or red, in a climate that's very maritime. Carcavelos are fortified wines that are aged oxidatively from white grapes or white or red grapes, but mainly white grapes that are fully ripe but not overripe, and characteristically chalky soils and an Atlantic climate. This is near Lisbon, Portugal. Banyuls, fortified, mostly oxidatively aged wines, generally from red grapes that are harvested a little late, so a little bit richer and a little bit lower in acid, but schist soils and a Mediterranean climate. Riva Salt, which is near Banyuls, generally made from slightly overripe white grapes, so it can be made from red grapes, also from schist soils and Mediterranean climates. So there's some commonalities here. There's some differences here. This is a bit of theory, but at least the idea here is just there are some things that you can take from the information here that'll help you understand why the wines taste the way they taste. But we're going to start with Madeira, and this is Madeira. It's a rock in the middle of the Atlantic, as close to Morocco as it is to Portugal. It doesn't look like where wine comes from. It's much more suited to bananas or sugarcane. But the wines of Madeira have such a diversity from nearly bone dry to nicely sweet, from young wines that are probably best suited for mixing and cooking to some of the oldest wines commercially available in the world. These bottles are actually in our stock in New Jersey. They're not cheap, but these bottles are from wines that are blended from wines that date back as far as the late 1700s, made at Henriques and Enriquez, one of only really 8 producers of Madeira left, and founded in 1850, but by a family that had grown grapes on the island since 1425. But there's 2 things that I want people to understand right off the bat when we talk about Madeira. We're going to spend more time on Madeira than we are on the other categories because it's the biggest, it's the most diverse, and probably the one that you had the best chance of hearing of before tonight. The first, Madeira is not port. On Madeira, grapes are picked early, originally to stave off disease, but then the higher acid style became known around the world. Port, the grapes are picked late. You get lower acid, more richness. The wines age off of their extract, whereas Madeira wines age off their acidity. Madeira ranges from dry to sweet, whereas port is mostly on the sweet side and mostly red grapes. Madeira is fortified with a spirit that's at 96% alcohol. Port is fortified with the same neutral grape spirit, but it's added in at 77% alcohol. What that means is that a bottle of Madeira is only about 10% of this neutral, flavorless spirit, whereas a bottle of port is about 20% of that same flavorless, neutral spirit, including more water. So port, frankly, Madeira is less diluted than port. Madeira undergoes direct and deliberate oxidation with the application of heat, again, either slowly or quickly, which we'll talk about in a moment. But that direct and deliberate oxidation right after fortification ensures that Madeira, when you open a bottle, you can keep it open for a very, very long time. The time scale is more along the lines of a bottle of whiskey than it would be a bottle of even port. In port, even older tawnies, they're protected from complete oxidation. They live in cool cellars. They're topped up a lot. And certainly the most renowned wines of port, the vintage wines, are very, very delicate once opened. Much more like a table red wine than anything else. And that's what it's, Madeira, shelf stable, port, not shelf stable. So that bottle of tawny port, 10-year-old tawny that you've had open for a year, probably not showing that great. But a bottle of Madeira at a year is just fine, unless you're down to the last few ounces, in which case you want to finish it off, just like a bottle of whiskey. Mm-hmm. The other is Madeira producers are not all alike. Almost none of the grapes grown on the island are grown by wine producers. H&H is the only producer of Madeira that's always been a farmer. H&H also, they don't play the birth year game. The main town on the island, Funchal, is a cruise ship port. So a lot of producers have a shop in that town, and they want to give everyone their birth year. The problem with that is if you do that many vintage bottlings, you don't have very much wine left. And what H&H does is they only offer very exceptional vintage bottlings, but then they have a lot more wine down in barrel for the blended wines, which are the two wines we're going to talk about tonight. Third is, and what that leads to are these last 2 points. One, the law for putting a grape name on a label in the European Union is that that grape has to be 85% of the wine. Most producers of H&H, because they don't have that big a bench of white grape Madeira, because the white grapes are relatively rare, if they bottle a Cercial or a Verdelho, a classic white grape, they're going to hit that 85% right away, and they're right on the dot, and their peg And they take that 15% and they use wine made of Tinta Negra, the red grape that's grown in much bigger swaths on the island, to kind of extend it. But Tinta Negra is creamier and you lose some of the cut in the wines. H&H's wines are much more sort of firm and bright. And we'll talk about how that works with food pairing. The other thing that H&H having that extra bench allows them to make age-stated wines where the ages are minimums, not averages. The law allows for age statements to be representative. Essentially, you say this is a 10-year-old, you give it to the tasting panel on the island, and if they think it's okay, it's fine. But generally, it means an average. But H&H's wines, being minimums, every drop of wine in the Verdelho 10-year-old we're going to talk about tonight is at least 10 years old. Well, you can taste for that. And we'll talk about that. But it has a lot to do with how the acids evolve as the wine ages and oxidizes. How do we get here? Well, the red arrow points to where Madeira is. This is Spain over here to the right and Portugal. And this is the New World over here. Again, it doesn't really look like where wine comes from. But the Portuguese settled the island in 1419, and they brought vines right away, much as they did everywhere in the world, including places like South Africa. The climate was inhospitable, the terrain was inhospitable, but they needed to make a crop each year. And so they started to pick the grapes a bit early, which meant the wine was pretty much rot gut, high acid and really tough. But they had customers. This little island here, was the last stopping off point for ships sailing to the New World. So by the 1500s, there were ships that would sail south from the UK or from France or from the Netherlands or Spain or Portugal. They'd stop off here to hit the trade winds, the winds coming off of Africa that also create hurricanes under the right conditions, and head to the New World. So they'd get their money, they'd roll this rot gut wine in barrel onto the ships. Then one day, the legend goes, some barrels returned from a hot, shaken up ocean voyage. They cracked open the barrels. They realized the wine had improved, that the heat had improved the wine. And so we kind of call this the first Madeira miracle, that heat, unlike anything anyone had ever thought of in the world of wine, the heat actually improved the wine. So they weren't idiots. Over time, they started to build heated rooms or put barrels of wine in the attic to force that heating and oxidation. That made the wine more valuable in trade. And that worked up until about the 1750s. And at that point, there was a bit of a glut of wine on the island, as well as much more competition from sherry and port and Malaga, a variety of places. And so at that point, there was also some distilling on the island from sugarcane, which was growing like a weed. And one enterprising soul figured out that if he added a bit of that sugarcane spirit to the wine, they could age it longer and let it evaporate and concentrate and evolve more. That created more value in trade for the wine. The customers were still the same; they were still headed to the New World. The taste for Madeira in the UK really only started when folks returned back after losing the Revolutionary War. And so that, friends, is the story whose punchline is the Declaration of Independence was toasted with Madeira. But just as importantly, and certainly more importantly for us today, the dinner afterwards was paired with Madeira as well. And if you make wines the right way and you harness that acidity and let it evolve, you get some of the most incredible food pairings you'll ever find. Today, Madeira wines are made in a sort of normal fortified wine process to start. The grapes come in, they start to ferment, and then they're hit with the 96% alcohol grape spirit, neutral grape spirit, to set a sugar level. At that point, the wines, there's a bifurcation. The wines can go into one of two processes. There's a fast process that's usually used for a grape called Tinta Negra, the red grape. That means that the wines will go into one of these tanks, which looks conspicuously like a jacketed brew kettle you'll see at a brewery, and it's heated at about 120 degrees Fahrenheit for several months, and that forces oxidation relatively quickly. The slower process, what's used for the finer wines, is to put the wines in these 620-liter old American oak barrels and put them in the attic, and you let the sun do the work. And it takes about 8 to 10 years for a barrel of Madeira to be to the point in oxidation where it can be moved out of the attic. So it takes a long time. H&H is rare amongst Madeira producers, is that all of their wines made from white grapes, the rare grapes, are made using this slower process. They don't try to speed anything up. The only time they use the tank, which is called an estufagem, or an estufa rather, is for wines made from Tinta Negra that are meant to be bottled young, the kind of wines that might be used for cooking or mixing. Grapes on the island, Bastardo and Muscatel on the right are very, very rare. Tinta Negra is the workhorse grape of the island. It can be made at any sweetness level and can make some very fine wines if you handle it very carefully. They'll always have a richer, more raisinated texture, though. Then the 5 white grapes are really the grapes that have made the renown of Madeira. And they're required to be made at very specific levels of residual sugar. Cercial has to be made the driest, then Tarentaise and Verdelho about the same, what's called medium dry. Boal, which is many people's favorite because it's sweet but not too sweet, and then Malvasia, which is the one that is made the sweetest. Each of them has its own characteristic, although none of them is particularly showy, except maybe for Tarentaise. Tarentaise has this exotic citrus character. Tarentaise, though, is a terrible grape to farm. And if you're a farmer that doesn't make wine and you're getting paid by weight, you never want to farm Tarentaise. And so H&H are the people who have saved the grape on the island. They farm about 80% of the 1.7 hectares that are on the island, and they usually buy the rest. So that allows them to offer a Tarentaise at a 20-year-old Tarentaise that is not a $700-800 wine like many of them can be. It's a little bit more affordable, and it's much like wine lovers will tend toward Burgundy eventually. Madeira lovers will often tend toward Tarentaise.
And then in terms of stills, because we recognize a lot of people probably recognize these, the only ones that I recognize for sure is Verdelho and Malvasia. To make what other still wines? Maybe Mike can answer that. Are they any of these used in Portugal, or Mike or Alicia? Any of these used in Portugal or Spain?
Oh, well, sure. No, I mean, what a great presentation. It's real, very interesting. And yeah, from my experience, and I'm based more in the Douro. And in terms of my work, I work mainly with the non-fortified reds and whites. And this is the region that the port wines are certainly known for. But oh no, I've certainly kind of a fondness for Madeira. It's often on my table and in my refrigerator. And it is very interesting. Yeah, you do have these unique mix of varietals that Portugal is known for. And that they may not be found anywhere else in the world, and that they would also occur in different parts of the country and sometimes by different names. And it's not to say it's precise, or we may even kind of believe it to be, but it may end up being something even slightly a little bit different, or kind of a variation of that. But one of my favorites in terms of names, because Portugal, in terms of the names of some varietals, maybe a little bit difficult to pronounce or a little bit unfamiliar, but the Cercial, which is certainly one of the noble varietals of Madeira, and one of the driest, high acid, certainly kind of a favorite of mine. In other parts of Portugal, it's known as, and if my pronunciation has this right, as Canacão, which means the dog strangler, which that has to be certainly one of my favorite names for a varietal. I don't know how that looks on a label, but yeah, certainly you would find some of these in some other corners.
Yeah. A couple of things to note. Verdelho is not Verdejo, the Spanish grape. The places you see this Verdelho elsewhere in the world are Hunter Valley in Australia, and a little bit in the Regional Lisboa, and in the Lisbon region. And then there's a couple of vineyards planted in California, actually, of this Verdelho. There's a long history of Portuguese immigration to the wine country in California. There's been Touriga Nacional in Northern California for a very, very long time, in particular. Malvasia, there are about 500 grapes called Malvasia in the world. This is 2 of them. There's Malvasia São Jorge, which was a modern variety that was developed on the Portuguese mainland, and then Malvasia Candia, or sometimes called Malvasia Candida, which is the original Malvasia from Crete. And H&H's Malvasia wines are a blend of both of those varieties. Tarentaise, pretty much planted nowhere else in the world. There is a grape on Pico in the Azores called Tarentaise de Pico, but it's not the same grape. Tinta Negra is sometimes, the folks on the Canary Islands think that it's the same as their Negramol, but the folks on Madeira don't. Bastardo, if I remember correctly, is Monduz. Mike, do you remember?
Well, it's also because Bastardo also is in Douro, as well as the Treixamons, which is kind of another region just over the mountains from Douro,
Yeah.
and then also known as Trousseau from Jura.
Yeah, Trousseau.
as well.
That's right, not Monduz. And then Moscatel. Again, there's very little on the island, basically just a study, a few rows in a study vineyard. And it's the same Moscatel that's in Setúbal, south of Lisbon, where a very prominent fortified wine is made. Cercial, we're not going to talk about a Cercial wine tonight, but very important. H&H's Cercials show this maturity of acidity really, really well. And when you get a properly matured Cercial, it's one of the most amazing things in the world to drink with oysters. In fact, we like to drink it straight out of the oyster shell. But the other part of H&H's legacy is as a farmer, and this is Quintagrand, and it's even more stunning in person. Quintagrand is the largest single vineyard on the island, and it's owned by H&H, and it is planted almost entirely to Verdelho, the grape that's required to be made medium dry. So H&H has always been known as a real Verdelho house. It's a stunning vineyard ringed in eucalyptus trees, which sometimes gives a little bit of a cast to the wine. And it really is the core, the heart of these two wines we're going to talk about. So Verdelho, it's not a fruity grape, even when it's fully ripe. The wines tend to be nutty. They tend to be a little bit even waxy is a word you're never supposed to use. But if you want to think of another grape that Verdelho has some characteristics in common with, I might say Semillon or Grenache Blanc, which I realize aren't that similar to each other. But and the wines, quite often the most versatile at table. This would have been the wines for gumbo in old New Orleans. For me, I love these with smoked fish. I love these with roast chicken. Still love it with gumbo. And then mountain style cow's milk cheeses. So for you guys in the Midwest, the Pleasant Ridge Reserve from Uplands Creamery in Wisconsin is a fantastic cheese for Verdelho wines. Now, when you taste these wines, we talk about these wines being 100% of the variety and minimum age. So when you taste Madeira, if you taste a creamy or raisinated character in the middle of your mouth, that's almost always a characteristic of Tinta Negra. Tinta Negra's acid is different. Tinta Negra's texture is different. It evolves like a red grape, so it gets creamier over time. And when you blend it in, it will always show through. In terms of tasting for age, Madeira is a wine made from underripe grapes. So the acid of a young Madeira is always going to be kind of like the acid of a very basic Vinho Verde. If you've had the one with the cat on the label, or there's a few very basic ones. Kind of I call it sunny delight acidity. It's prickly and tingly on the tip of your tongue. Well, as that acid evolves, especially with the application of heat, the expression of it, I find, moves farther and farther back on your tongue until it becomes, at full maturity, this sort of fulsome character, cleansing the entire palate. And so when you taste a Madeira wine, if you taste that a little bit of tingle on the tip of your tongue, it's almost certainly the case that there's young wine in the blend. And more mature Madeira is Madeira that refresh, these are all strongly flavored foods. And it's that, in this case, it's the acidity that's refreshing the palate from those foods. We have two wines we're talking about tonight, the 10-year-old and the 15-year-old. And this is where we get to have a little whiskey analogy. When a producer, let's say a Scotch distillery, bottles two wines at two different age statements, the second, or two whiskeys at two different age statements, let's say a 10-year-old and a 15-year-old, it's not just that the 15-year-old is 5 years older. It's that the producer has made a blending decision for the 10-year-old and a blending decision, a profile decision for the 15-year-old, which they can take in a lot of different directions. Pat or Brett, do you have a good example of that you might want to talk about in the whiskey world, where it's not just
tons of good examples. The one that you can see it because they actually advertise the most openly on the label would be something like Glenfiddich.
I was going to say the same
Whereas
thing.
Glenfiddich clearly does, they have a 10-year-old or 12-year-old, which is their regular age statement, which is bourbon heavy because that's what they age in, but has some sherry and some other red wines in. But their 15-year-old, they purposely combine in a Solera where they vat in a huge 1,000+ liter vat. How big is that vat, Pat?
I think they have several, and they range from 1,500 to 2,500 liters, I think.
And heavier sherry influence. And so they specifically, it's not just 12-year-old that got older. It's very specifically selected for that. And then it changes again when they go to, and it changes very much when they go to 18 as well.
Yeah. And so each producer has to make these decisions. Now, at H&H, the differences from barrel to barrel are subtler. It's not like one barrel is a sherry cask, another barrel is, a bourbon cask or something like that. But they still make those same decisions.
How much
what they've decided is they want all of their 15-year-olds, Cercial, Verdelho, Boal, and Malvasia, to show the most aromatically rich expression of that grape. Whereas they want their 10-year-olds to be the most food-friendly expression, the most sort of, they want it to show that great acid maturity, but still some slightly primary character, because they feel that makes it the best at the table, because the wines are priced differently enough that more people are going to drink the 10-year-olds with a meal maybe than the 15-year-olds. And so that's a thread that runs through all of H&H's white grape wines. And I think it's really important, if you're looking for a particular style, not to just look at the age statement, but to think about that as well. It's very clear when you taste through H&H's wines.
And Jake, once they move out of the attic, are the storage climates pretty consistent? Like the attic is consistent, then they come out and they go to a different area. In other words, do they have some heated, some not heated? Do they have some shaded, not, or are they pretty consistent?
The attic obviously fluctuates from summer to winter. The main floor is relatively consistent, but not that cool, right? It's not the sort of chalky cave champagne 52 degrees situation. It's cool. You could in theory mature normal wine there, but it's not super cold. The other thing is there's so much less wine here than you think about basically any other wine producing region in the world, notable wine producing region in the world. So they don't have a bunch of different rooms because they don't have that much wine.
15 is incredible. Absolutely incredible.
Now H&H's cellar is right on the water. And so when we talk about the first three of these four categories we're talking about, all have some element of maritime aging, and it's much subtler than I think the marketers would have you believe. But there's certainly, these barrels are used for over 100 years, and over time, that much time in those environments, each barrel is its own terroir. The microflora and other things in that barrel do start to express. Now we'll take
Jake, we got a bit of a backlog of questions from Facebook. Can we maybe address some of those first?
Yeah, let's do that.
John had asked, he said he only gets rancho notes in French brandies. Dan, this is for you. Since they use grapes high in acidity, does more acidity contribute to more rancho notes?
That's a very good question. Certainly the difference in the pH of the wine going into a brandy and the brandy coming out of the still are quite different. So I don't think it's as clear as just the acidity, but there is something about maturing wines or brandies in this case that are picked from fruit at a different level of ripeness. The one thing that is consistent between what we're talking about here with these wines and wines that you might initially start with for brandy production is the fruit's harvested what most winemakers would call immature. And it's not so much that the fruit itself is immature, but it's not really concentrated in a way that gives the wine a very full and forceful aroma or palate at that concentration. And both brandies and the wines we're talking about today undergo this other type of concentration. And there, I think you see similarities with the term rancio. It's this other type of concentration, either distillation and then maturation, or this hot maturation and concentration, which give the wines their structure and the ability to transform these flavors. That may be a long-winded explanation, but it's the best I can do.
I think it's fair. And another question from Facebook, OJ asked, how much effort goes into a vineyard when you're going to be aging wines that will be sold for hundreds of dollars a bottle? Mike too, do you see a difference in how those are handled in the vineyard based on what the end bottle is going to be, or do you even know that at that point?
Oh, well, it's a good question. I mean, and certainly all different types of wine styles, and obviously some very expensive wines and still wines, and there would be a tremendous amount of effort that's kind of placed in the vineyards that would certainly be kind of a component to support the quality and sort of prices that those wines might see. And that certainly could very well is the case with the Madeira wines, and I know it much better in terms of ports, but you have special sites and special vineyards, and certainly Madeira as well too, for areas known for kind of certain varietals, and yes, so some of those practices certainly would kind of alter depending upon that. But I think certainly some of the specialness of these wines is this patience in terms of time. I mean, these noble varietals, of which can be quite rare, and then this the use of the Cantera method, this more kind of gentle application of heat and oxygen and time to be oftentimes tasting a kind of a piece of history. Certainly kind of contributes to the rarity and ultimately kind of the expense of the wines. But yeah, good question.
There's one Malvasia vineyard on the island that is only accessible by boat. Quintagrand ain't that easy to get to either. I think again, the analogies with whiskey and brandy are really important, are really on point here. The characteristic of selectivity and rarity is as much than what goes on in the vineyard is important. And if the beauty of H&H's work at Quintagrand and farming Verdelho and Tarantage in particular are, they're growing grapes to make a wine, not to make a weight. And so they're able to be much more precise with how they work it. But the yields here are not super low. It was never customary to do that. And honestly, a lot of these vines have been farmed for so long to not be super low yield that if you tried to do them at super low yield, you might kill them, or you might cause them to go nuts. So it's much more of only occasionally does a wine merit extra maturation, and so it's that selectivity and rarity that's so important.
Then Jake, another one. Neutral spirits used to fortify Madeira. Does the raw material matter? You said that they likely use all cane because it grows, or does it have to be grape? They used to. What do they? Is it grape based now?
So wine politics are politics, and so while cane spirit was used to fortify the wines a long time ago, they actually now use the same spirit that's used in port, except they don't dilute it before they add it to the wine. So it's neutral grape spirit. I don't want to call it brandy. I use brandy for something that's flavorful. This is neutral grape spirit.
Although I'll throw my Portuguese. I think, Andorra will at least called aguardente, and I assume that would be kind of a similar sort of expression in Madeira.
Yeah, and then Chris is also suggesting turtle soup, which is 100% agreement.
Oh yeah, turtle soup is classic Verdelho food.
And then if we heard, so we might as well broach this. So Sotalone can make urine smell of maple syrup, not unlike the asparagus effect. Is there anything chemical? I mean, we need to explore that. Is Dan?
I think you should. I think all of you should buy many cases of these wines and report back next week.
You're the closest to a molecular biologist of anybody in this room.
I don't know what that is, but there's a mushroom that does it as well. It's called candy cap. It's Lactarius fragilis for those in the know. And actually, not only does it occur in urine, but you'll actually sweat that fenugreek maple syrup aroma. So it's
So if you
Actually,
got
we've
a
had
friend that
candy
sweats
caps.
a lot, you got to secretly sneak some of these mushrooms into their diet.
And candy caps are awesome. We brought some candy caps back from California a couple of years ago, and they're great.
All right,
moving on.
I promise the rest of them won't take that long. So next we'll take a short 2-hour flight to Lisbon and come to the area known as Carcavelos. The fellow on your left there is the Marquess of Pombal, who in 1756 demarcated the Douro region for port. And by doing so, created a situation where the grapes he grew were not allowed to be sold into port for making port. So he said, well, the heck with that, I'll make my own appellation called Carcavelos, named after the town near his estate. In fact, the only extant producer of Carcavelos, who's not the producer we're talking about tonight, still makes their wine in one of his palaces. What we're talking about here is about halfway between Lisbon and the ocean, but around Lisbon, there's this arc of chalky soils that go, pretty much go from north of Lisbon around the airport and down to Cascais, the town you see on the left there, before you get to the sandy soils of the beach, where a very famous wine called Colares is made. Now, chalky soils, people all over the world look for chalky soils to plant wine grapes. Mike, do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Oh, well, yeah, most definitely. I mean, these are, that's a famous type of a soil type that is certainly from other kind of well-known producing regions in Champagne and then in the UK. And so, yeah, it's, certainly kind of a unique sort of desirable soil that they are lucky enough to kind of have in this part of Portugal.
One of my favorite.
What does it provide? I mean, so what does chalky soil provide to fruit growing?
Mike?
Well, that's a good question, and it's not to say I would be able to kind of speak to it sort of precisely. There's a lot of factors that obviously influence sort of the resulting sort of grapes that come from kind of a piece of land. This kind of notion of terroir, and soils are certainly kind of components of it. Of other microclimatic sort of factors and exposition and site and how one kind of farms those sites. And it's not to say it's always kind of like a core one-to-one sort of translation in terms of the minerals in the soil or the chalkiness or the limestone and how that kind of contributes to kind of mineral type aromas and flavors that exist within wine that might not be the case. But nonetheless, I mean, these types of soils have sort of distinguished themselves in some very, very distinctive sort of ways and with some very famous wine styles.
But even just for instance in cognac, right? We think of the characteristic cru, the Grand Champagne and the Petit Champagne of the core of the cognac region. Really, all the cru of cognac are basically mapped around the level of limestone content in the soils, and the limestone content of the soils is so high. And I think this is kind of an interesting thing to think about in very broad terms: wine, spirits, what have you. The limestone content is so high that actually the grapes don't do very well there. The pH of the soil is too high. It's much too high for grapes. And those are the areas that produce the finer quality wines for very, very long-term aging. So sometimes you get this inversion of qualities, right? Where poor ecological niches produce extremely beautiful outcomes with wines.
Yeah. I mean, Burgundy being the most classic example, where it's essentially the crus of Burgundy are almost mapped out as to limestone content in the soil as well. One of my favorite stories about this is there was a fella named Josh Jensen who drove all over the middle of Monterey and San Benito counties in California, more or less kicking the dirt until the dust came up white. And he drove to the top of a hill, sort of looks like a nothing burger in the middle of a flat plain of warmth. And he got to the top and he kicked the dirt, and the dirt came back white. And he said, "Upon this rock, I will build my winery." That winery is called Calera. I think you might have heard of it. And the wines from the top of that mountain, Mount Harlan, are some of the most important wines made in the New World anywhere. So the point of talking about chalky soils is that it's almost never the case that sweet wines or fortified sweet wines are made on those soils. And so this is Carcavelos is a really, really rare thing. It's an appellation only for fortified wine. You can use both white and red grapes. And the red grapes generally form kind of an accent if they're used at all. Villa Warish, the producer that still makes wine in the region, does not use them. And they're, I mean, Mike, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about Castelao and Trincadero. You certainly know more about them than I do.
Sure. Well, in terms of some of these varietals, and I certainly recognize and know them, and a bit familiar with some of them. And things like the Castelao as well too. Or the Trincadero, which is the Tinta Amarella, which we have in Douro. The Castelao is certainly kind of a trending varietal as well. It does have some nice fresh acidity. They can make some very nice red wines out of it. I got a good friend in Douro who makes kind of a single casta wine from Castelao. So these, even though we don't necessarily have strong traditions among the reds for single varietal wines, these are certainly some very interesting, very high quality varietals.
Yeah, Castelao is a funny one in that much of the local market for wine in Portugal is for very big and brooding red wines. Castelao does not make a very big and brooding red wine, and so often the best ones are exported. The white grapes, which form the core, as in the case in many of these sorts of things, Galego Dourado is a grape that's only grown in Carcavelos. Boal is called Ratinho in Carcavelos, but it's the same Boal that's on Madeira. But the one I want to focus on is Irintu. Irintu, in many ways, could be described as the Riesling of Portugal. It can be made at almost any level of sweetness, and it is hyper expressive of soil. And so again, it's a pretty rare thing to have exalted grape on an exalted terroir being used to make fortified wine. And it's all because of this guy who wrote himself out of port. Now, Carcavalish wines were extremely renowned in the 1700s and 1800s. They were known to Jefferson. They were part of Christie's first wine auction in London. They were part of the care package of Portuguese identity products sent for the Portuguese court's first state visit to China. Sadly, Port's tie with the British wine trade was so strong that Carcavelos never really kept its cachet. Now, these two wines that we're going to talk about are by their very nature foraged wines. Quinta dos Peixes, or Quinta dos Pesos, is a family estate, very cloistered, near the town of Carcavelos. The whole appellation is 25 hectares, and 12 and a half of those hectares were on this estate. They weren't all under vine, but again, wine politics are politics, and this family felt the need to preserve Carcavelos as best they could. And so in 1985, they started to bring the vines that were there kind of back to life. And they had the wine made from 1987 to 2004. They even released a couple of wines using both the white and red varieties, but this is not a full-time winery. They had no full-time staff, and they had no equipment. So they bought some tanks, they bought a press. They picked all the white grapes and red grapes together on the same day. They crushed them together, they fermented them together, they fortified them together. They had no barrels, so they bought all new French oak, some of the finest barrels I've ever seen in my life. Racked them down in and let them age in this gravel floor barrel room. Relatively constant temperature there, not super hot, but it did get warm in the summer. Then in 2004, the old man died, and there was no staff to look after the wines. And so for 12 years, the wines weren't touched. And they evaporated and evaporated and evaporated and concentrated and oxidized and oxidized. And then we got to taste them, and then we started buying them as fast as we could. We've bottled 8 vintages. Early 2019, they were bottled. 1987, 88, 89, and 90 are all single barrels. There's another whiskey term for you. And then 91, 96, 97, and 98, we have some more quantity of. But these wines, with all that extra oxidation and that little bit of extra time for especially the red grape components to sort of evolve and get more earthy and creamy, these wines are really incredibly intense, incredible acidity, which comes from the Irintu and the extra evaporation. Some are funkier than others. Some are more kind of golden, honey, orange, caramel type characteristics than others. But they are, like nothing else in the world and exceedingly, exceedingly rare. 2 vintages in focus tonight, although again, the other vintages are available from our distributor. The 1998, the youngest of the wines, 4 barrels were blended to make this bottling. This one is definitely on the rancio side. There's some mushroom to it. There's some other earthy notes to it. There's less of the sort of fresh citric notes that you sometimes see in some of the very old wines, like the 1989. And when I say relatively dry here, I don't necessarily mean sugar level. I just mean that it has this sort of drying character on the palate, which makes it particularly handy with things like pâtés and terrines, especially foie gras, or very, very delicate custard desserts. The 1989, 9 years of extra aging, and 9 years of extra evaporation and concentration, only 1 barrel left. This one is turned up to 11. We're going to talk about that again in a moment. Much more golden characteristic. The rancio is very integrated. The acidity is pretty wild for a wine that's this sweet and this old. We are also getting close to being out of it. So we also have, our distributor does keep the 87, 88, and 1990 in Illinois. And of course, we have all 8 vintages available. They do keep the 97, 98 as well.
And we do have these on the shelf at the very least at Lincoln Park. This 89 is stunning.
Yeah, but when it's gone, it's gone. So, but plenty of I would say the 87 is the closest to the 89, as well as the 91. The 87, 89, and 91 are kind of a cluster. The 88, 90, and 98 are kind of a cluster. And then the 96 is like the 98, but darker in characteristics, kind of almost more, I sometimes taste in colors here. And then the 97 is like the 91, but a little bit more lifted and a little bit higher alcohol. So they are different, but they're not so different that if one vintage doesn't happen to be available, that you won't love another vintage. So.
I can't believe we sell this 89 for $50 a bottle. That is ridiculous.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a half-size bottle.
It's a 500. I mean, it's a 500. Yeah. It's not even
you're right. It's more than a half-size bottle. I mean, that's a ludicrous price for something this cool. I mean, this hits all the marks for any person who's interested in cool spirits and cool wine. I mean, it's like you said, exceedingly rare. It is so full of character. It's vintage. It's just awesome. Single barrel. It's crazy. A single barrel wine. When have you had one of those before?
I think I could speak for Mike and probably any winemaker out there that we firmly agree. It's crazy that you can sell something like this at that price.
It's crazy.
It's a lot of work.
You looted a dead guy's cellar of all this awesome wine, apparently, and you're
like I said, it's a foraged wine. I do have a bit of breaking news. The 1992 vintage is being bottled today and tomorrow. And we'll have quite a lot of that as well. So it's this is a little bit of a rescue operation. The family, the family is not in the wine business. They do other things to make their business. And so the wine, the older wines, they do kind of want to get them out. There is some thought as to re-resurrecting the vines and making a bit more wine, but this is also a company that let their winery license lapse last January, so we couldn't come and bottle last February. So again, not a full timer. So, but stunning wines, really cool little thing.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, just to sort of comment, yeah, these are little treasures. I mean, this kind of region, this piece of history. You know, one of kind of the 4 Vino Generosos, or these fortified wine styles of Portugal. And yeah, part of it's just sort of the proximity to Lisbon. I mean, some of these are very desirable sort of places, and just kind of real estate and just sort of the people homes. And so yeah, it's really, really awesome that there's an opportunity that this is that we to kind of preserve this piece of history. That's extraordinary.
Yeah, only 25 hectares in the appellation, and they're protected from further development, and that's the only reason why there hasn't been further development, because they are beautiful. These are wines, frankly, nobody's ever heard of these wines really in America. They exist essentially on sommelier tests, and in fact, some of our business in these wines is from sommeliers who've been asked about them on a test but have never tasted one. So that's kind of cool, kind of heartening. But who knows what the future holds? We'd certainly love to see that. We do represent the one producer that is making wine, Vila Oeiras. It's actually a municipally owned winery in the town of Oeiras, which is also within the region, working out of the old palace of the Marquess of Pombal. We bring in a 15-year-old from them, and then a 12-year-old that's aged only in Portuguese oak, because they've been doing a lot of oak experiments as well. So. All right, now we'll move to another place with a great deal of identity, and that is the Roussillon. The Roussillon is the French part of Catalonia. So Catalonia, we think of Catalonia as Spain, but there's one département in France that also very strongly identifies within with Catalan culture and upbringing, and that is the area known as the Roussillon. While the dry wines of the area have gotten quite a bit of renown recently, the traditional wines of the region are fortified wines, what are called vin doux naturel, literally wine natural sweet. These are wines that are that were codified in the 1930s as wines made with mutage, with fortification to stop the fermentation. We're going to talk about two categories tonight: Banyuls and Riva Salt. We're going to start with Banyuls, which is, again, another maritime appellation. You'll notice that the appellation is hard by the ocean. If you zoom in on this, you would essentially see a bowl, a C-shaped bowl with the town of Banyuls-sur-Mer in the middle, and that is the height, the top vineyards of the appellation. These are primarily red. There is a small amount of white fortified wine made there, some dry wine made with the appellation Collioure. But these are mainly red fortified wines made from Grenache Noir as the grape. Look at it. There's that bowl I was telling you about in the town. There's a bunch of different climatic influences or terroir influences here. You've got wind, the so-called tramontane wind, so strong. It's called that because it's so strong that it could go through the mountains. You've got the salt of the Mediterranean Sea and the cooling of the Mediterranean Sea. And you have a variety of volcanic soils, most notably black schist, which creates a real heat sink for the vines. Other than the hotter parts of the Douro, I can think of no place in the world that's more suited to making fortified wines than this place. And what's interesting is that the style of fortified wines that has evolved in this region is one of slightly lower alcohol, less fortifying spirit added, not quite as ripe grapes as grapes picked for port. And I sort of think of this as Burgundy to Port's Bordeaux in a lot of ways, where this is the gentler, can be more elegant, whereas port is that great robust character, especially tannins for aging in bottle. But the typical large vats here used in the region. Now, Mas Blanc is the defining producer of Banyuls. They were the first producer to bottle their own wines in the region. Their Sostrera, what they call their Solera, actually was established before the appellation was established. After World War II, Jean-Michel Parcet, who is the retiring winemaker, the third generation, his grandfather devised a way for the producers to get a bit of extra money in by making wine almost exactly like how vintage port is made, bottled less than a couple of years after vintage. And thus was born Banyuls Rimage, which is some of the greatest Banyuls in the world are this less aged style. But it's Banyuls Traditionnel, or Banyuls aged generally at least 5 years in barrel, not heated, not with a very low fill, but certainly oxidatively aged. That is the core of both the history of Mas Blanc and the history of Banyuls.
And their heritage is printed right on those barrels.
Yeah, there's the Catalan, the red and gold Catalan insignia right there. It's a pretty fierce place. So the wine we're going to talk about tonight is a wine called Le Colloque, or colloquy or colloquium in English. This is the sort of core expression of Banyuls from Mas Blanc. It's a perpetual cuvee, so not technically a Solera, although they have a Solera there too, which we bottle a wine called Sostrera from. This is a perpetual cuvee, so 2/3 of this wine is wine that has been aged 5 years, 6 years, 7 years in barrel. 1/3 of the wine is the previous cuvee. So the cuvee was dates back to the mid 1990s. It used to be called the cuvee Dr. André Parcet, but now it's called Le Coloc. And it really is a really cool way to see how fresh and intense fruit from slightly younger Banyuls, and then the real evolution of quite firm tannins from older Banyuls comes together to create a lot of complexity and a lot of food friendliness. This is lower in alcohol than a lot of Banyuls. It's under 17%. The kind of thing you could have with a mountain cheese or a blue cheese, or even with lamb in a rich sauce, which is very much how Jean-Michel likes to serve it. These are wines that, yes, happen to be fortified and happen to have residual sugar, but by no means are super hot or sweet.
Oh, not there. This is just the complexity of the mouthfeel is, because you're right. There's certainly sugar there when you taste it, but there is a mouth in all the food you've been to. There's a mouth coating dryness. There just is a mouth coating dryness that you're getting all the sweet flavors at the same time that it's removing moisture. So I can just see that with like a blue cheese or something really creamier lamb. Yeah, this is the level of complexity that you don't normally think about when you think about dessert wines. I think the trope is that the dessert wines are sweet.
Yeah, these wines, they are. If you go in the past, before the appellation was founded, the wines were sometimes fortified, they sometimes weren't, and the sugar levels were all over the map. But I think the core here also comes from the fact that the Parcets were the people that introduced dry wine to the region. They were instrumental in creating that Collioure appellation. And when they did that, they realized they had to step up their planting and farming game as well. So the vines that go into this wine are either what are called massals, or cuttings from their own vines that go back to just after phylloxera, or the Grenache cutting, or their Grenache cuttings from a little place you might have heard of called Chateau de Beaucastel. So, the terroir here is amazing. The pedigree of the plant material is amazing, and then this sort of perpetual cuvee is a great way to sort of see that blending of young and old, or youngish and oldish. So, Grenache, I've learned so much about Grenache. Grenache has always been kind of a bugaboo grape for me, because so many of the ones from like the Southern Rhone are very hot and alcoholic. But I've learned so much about the making of Grenache from tasting the sweet wines here as well as the dry wines, which is pretty.
And then stylistically, how is this? So since we're talking about that really that prominent dryness, stylistically, how much is this stylistically sort of indicative of what comes from Banyuls, or is this on one end of a spectrum?
I would say that the way this wine, I would say that, in terms of sugar level, this wine's kind of in the middle of the road, and maybe a little bit on the dry side, but it's more the forceful expression of the soils and the grapes that you see here that you don't see in many Banyuls producers.
Okay.
There are there's certainly great old Rancio Banyuls that have spent many years in barrel, and sometimes those wines end up showing a great signature of site, and sometimes they're just the wines are made a bit sweeter, so as that you just get still beautiful wines, but mainly from just the evolution of the fruit. Now, as we move inland, still on volcanic, still on schistic soils, we get to a much larger appellation called Riva Salt. And Riva Salt, while there is a little bit of coastal in Riva Salt, most of Riva Salt is inland. So now this is the first wine we're going to talk about that has no maritime influence. Riva Salt is mostly made from white grapes, so it certainly can be made from red grapes. And then, of course, we'll talk about a very special grape that this wine is made from. Again, the wines are fortified, and again, these are all over the map. Riva Salt can be bottled almost immediately after fortification, especially wines made from Muscat in Riva Salt are sometimes bottled as a Christmas wine in the same vintage that they were harvested. And then some of the oldest wines in barrel in France are in Riva Salt, because if you get a great site and you get great grapes, the wines the wines can evolve so glacially, and really this interplay between rancio and acidity comes out so much after many, many years in barrel. And then there's the Domaine de Sau, or the Chateau de Sau in Tuire. Tuire is also where beer Quinquina comes from, if you remember from episode 2. And this is the place. This is Beatrice, the owner. Her husband was the winemaker. This is another foraged wine. Unfortunately, Hervé passed away many years ago, but he left a barrel room that is unlike any other aging environment I have ever seen. And it is the single draftiest place I have ever seen alcoholic beverage barrels. And that goes for whiskey or brandy or wine. Now at Sau, the grapes are entirely of a variety called Grenache Gris. Grenache Gris, as you might expect, is a pink-skinned grape. It is in the Grenache family, and often as a table wine can be a bit difficult or soft, or in many cases blousy or alcoholic. But on old sites and handled well, that extra texture translates into an incredible opulence as the other characteristics of the wine come out in oxidation. And while Sau is definitely very much known for dry rancio made from Grenache Gris, it's these Rivesaltes we're talking about tonight, and that sugar provides a wonderful frame for the insanity that happens in this barrel room. So there's a picture of Hervé. So this barrel room, if you're looking at that wall, to your left is a similar pile of barrels of dry rancio. To your right is another pile of barrels that looks like that. Behind you is an old broken down BMW motorbike, and none of the windows work. That Tramontane wind is even hotter and stronger here than it is down in Banyuls. So if you think about it, you have these wines that go into barrel, relatively full barrels, and the evaporation can be as much as 10% a year. It's insane. I think, what's the rule of thumb that the bourbon people do? 6%?
7 to 8.
Yeah.
7 to 8, or actually a little bit more in first year, and then 7 to 8.
Right. Here it's close to 10, and they never top up. They never rack. And so what you end up with is, whenever, especially talking about Riva Salt, whenever a wine like this is maturing, you're getting, you start with something that has some acidity, but a lot of sweet fruit and sugar, and a lot of texture when it's made from Grenache Gris. As the wine evaporates and oxidizes, the fruit tamps down and turns more secondary and then tertiary. But because the liquid is evaporating, the expression of acidity starts to go up. And for about the first 15 to 20 years of maturity, that acid structure gets more and more prominent on the palate. And then eventually another equilibrium is reached, and the acid then starts to complex out. You see this in the maturity of Madeira as well, maturation of Madeira as well. So, but because these wines are evaporating so fast because of this crazy draft, the concentration is so high at 15, 20 years of age that you end up essentially with basically a double Riva Salt, if you will. And I already said that the Carcavelos go to 11. This one goes to 11 too. You guys have the wine in front of you, so I'd love for you guys to talk about what you're tasting in the wines. But Brett and Pat,
this is an awesome wine. I mean, this is an incredible wine.
Yeah, it's
Go ahead.
I was gonna say, they're for me, what strikes again the complexity, and I use that word, and now I need to double down on that for this particular one versus the Banyuls, because the Banyuls, maybe I was confusing contrast and complexity, because the Banyuls, I was getting a distinct amount of sugar and sweetness and dried fruit that was there, but it was also really mouth-coatingly dry, if that's such a thing. Whereas this is dry, but more as you might think of a Sauterne, like the dryness you would get out of a Sauterne or something like that. That's complexity.
Yeah, this is what's the French word? Dan sapidité.
you know what's curious to me is how, and Mike, maybe you probably know much more about this than I do, of being a winemaker in Portugal, in a number of places, but especially Portugal, like how you can get fruit very ripe and still get that beautiful acidic tannic structure. I mean, Grenache is particularly for me, at least, an interesting example because it can express itself so differently, you know, through Catalonia and Rhone, but Portugal's got a lot of these grapes, right, that can really can grow in this sort of really hot, dry environment and still maintain that structure even at high ripeness levels. That's
Yeah, no, well, it's a great sort of observation, Dan. Yeah, no, it is really interesting, and yeah, I mean, I've certainly got a fondness for the Vendu Naturals as well, but I guess my work being kind of more in Portugal, yeah, you know, I'm a bit more familiar with the fortified wine styles that we have there in Iberia. But yeah, it is interesting. No, but you know, all these wines, I mean, you know, even fortified wines, I mean, these are still wines, and so there's still a question of kind of balance. And although Douro certainly can be, it's a mountainous region. We have a diversity of some different sites throughout the region and expositions, and it is a warm climate. And although ports can have a bit of overripeness, or it's not necessarily a problem. But there still is a question of balance, and you still want to have acidity. I mean, it is a balancing sort of component of all wine, including fortified wines. And if some of these varietals, and if they're kind of adapted to these types of places and climates, and that's something that's kind of developed over centuries to kind of identify these that are able to kind of preserve their varietals, or in the case in Douro, the use of blends. You know, less kind of dependent on maybe a sort of a single varietal. So we have other varietals that, depending upon the season, would ripen differently. And then even today, sort of with climate change, there are newer varietals that we look to that are able to kind of maintain their kind of freshness. And certainly my work on the Douro wines, I mean, freshness is certainly kind of an important component. But no, good question.
Yeah, these are, it just is the layer. I mean, you talk about, this is like honey, and there's like a buttery character. There's a honeyed character to it. There's dried fruit. There's that little bit of acidity again that I think is a hallmark of a really good complex Sauterne, even though you typically think of them as, you know, there just is so much going on, and they're all flavors that are very, on their own, would seem to be subtle, yet stand out in a group.
I think, Dan, to your question, and these wines, when they're young, don't have that much acidity. It's that the way they basically, you know, we talked about this a little bit when we talked about tongue mapping. Like, what you taste is often what's left when the rest of your tongue has been blown away, and it's the same thing here as the expression, the fat, the gras, the fat expression of Grenache Gris goes away during oxidation. You get these underlying flavors, these rancio flavors and rich flavors, honeyed flavors, but there's more room for the acidity to play on the palate. And so the expression, the concentration of acidity goes up because of the evaporation, but the expression of the acidity has more room to play. But I have to ask, because we've got Brett and Pat on here, if this wine were a whiskey, what would it be? Like, what whiskey would give you the same kind of feeling as a wine like this? I always ask this to my whiskey friends about these wines.
A pure pot still Irish that was aged in multiple use ex-American oak.
There is, if you get very lucky.
Close.
If you get very lucky.
There's, because of the fruit, because of like the fruit and the honeyed character. I mean, we're
the
lovers.
Combination of honey and citrus and just that thick mouthfeel. Yeah, the closest thing, you know, front to back, I would say, would be Irish pot still.
Yeah,
and we're very right. The whiskey hotline are big flag bearers for pure pot still style of. I mean, that is the indigenous style of Ireland, and should be very proudly carried forward as the indigenous whiskey style of Ireland.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's where I would go too. Going back to Carcavelos, a few years ago, Teeling did a cast strength single cask Carcavelos or cast strength Carcavelos finish bottling.
Yeah, Jack actually sent us because we asked about it somewhere, and Jack actually sent us a
I bought a
sample
bottle
of
in California. I don't know if it all went there, but
yeah, those got spread out because we've done a couple of things. They're doing some really cool stuff with Xwood. We this year bought an acacia cask.
ooh,
And a
yeah, we
Madeira.
did. And 2 years ago, or last year, we did a chestnut. And this year was acacia and Madeira.
well, save me some, please, if I ever get
Yeah.
to travel again. But I think the lesson here is that there a lot of the same methods of tasting and a lot of the same sort of thinking about evolution are when you taste extra aged spirits, whether they be whiskey or brandy, or these sorts of wines are very similar. In spirits, the acids are much subtler, but but the wood expression has to evolve quite a bit more because the alcohol is ripping so much out of the wood, even from old barrels. Here, the acid is really important, and the idea of freshness is different than it is in a spirit. We started on that. Well, we end on that. Dan, do you want to talk about?
No, I was just going to say, like, the concept, like, you can also see it really clearly in traditional balsamic vinegar, where you start with extremely high acid grapes, Trebbiano commonly, let's say. You concentrate those and then you age them for very, very long periods of time. And the evolution of the concentrated acidity and the evolution of those now concentrated wines really produce this type of vinegar, which is really reminiscent in certain ways of the kinds of processes that these wines undergo.
What grape did we use this year?
This year we used.
Was that the Riesling that we pulled?
Oh God, I gotta look at my notes. That's a really good question.
Or do you only because we have just we have horned in a couple of us have horned in on the battery of balsamic style vinegar that has been grown or is in Daniel
It's
Farber's
aging in Dan's attic.
Cal's distributor. Yes,
but it's the same kind of notion. Very acidic
Right.
grapes, then concentration in that case through forced heating. It's funny enough. It's like it's heated, it's evaporated, and then it goes into a fermentation, and then this long aging process. Many decades, which produce a completely different style of thing. So, like everything Jake talked about tonight, that there's a thread there of acidity and aging and rancio. And there's a family of these things.
Yeah, no, you're actually, now that you think about that, you're 100% right. But balsamic, I think that has to be the reason why people like balsamic vinegar, because of that level of complexity.
Hey, Jake needs to show off his website.
No. I just wanted, there's a lot more than we could talk about in this hour and a bit. And I did want to just show you where you can find more information on our website, the House Alpens website. Of course, great information on the Binny's website as well. So this is the front page of the House Alpens website. We've talked about this before with the recipe page and some other stuff. If you go mouse over wines here, you'll see the aromatized wines that we talked about over the first few sessions. But then the main page of Sodalone is right there, Sodalone selections. And that'll get you to all the categories that we work in. You can click on a category. So let's say Riva Salt. That'll get you to a page on Riva Salt with pages on each wine. Or you can just scroll down on this page till you find what you like. There's our dry rancios, Riva Salts, Maury, which is the inland equivalent to Banyuls, hotter, windier, less maritime influence, but still some beautiful wines. Banyuls, we have some old and rare Banyuls, although most are in just sort of notional stock. If you are looking for Banyuls with some extra age on it, I would advise to look at these 7 wines, the Collection. These are also single barrel wines bottled in 2017. And we have decent stock on all of those. So 2002, 2000, 92, 86, 82, 78, and 75, all in stock in the USA. And I believe actually that our distributor in Illinois keeps a little bit at their warehouse. Grenache d'Empordà, which is a vin du naturel, if you will, from the Spanish side of the border. And then Carcavelos. So Plenty of great stuff. And then, of course, the Madeiras are down at the bottom. So plenty of great information on all of these wines, food pairings, history, process, and some great photos as well.
Well, Jake, thanks a lot. This was awesome as usual. Oh, we might have a question here. Chris, big compliment to Jake. So, Chris, thanks for joining us. If anybody else has any other questions, now's the time to ask them. Otherwise, you can always hit up Brett and I at spirits@bennies.com. And if
I try to go back
it's about wine, we'll ask Alicia. What's that, Jake?
Yeah, I try to go back in the comments on the Facebook as well and answer stuff later on. We will have another session, not sure exactly when, but
yeah, we do want to cover how to taste gin.
I have an idea of our guest. I've got a couple of ideas for who we can bring in just to sort of speak to that. One from a friend of ours who's a distiller, another one who runs a gin bar here in Chicago, who I think can speak to that a little bit. So if we want to do that Monday.
Well, let's give it, we got to plan a little more time here. So I don't know about next Monday, maybe the Monday after. Keep an eye on the Bennies page, and we'll get our act together, and then we'll cover how to taste gin. Okay, sound fair?
And you tell us, I mean, if you want mixology stuff, we can talk mixology stuff. You want to do a thing on what vermouth to pair with what scotch to make great Rob Roys, we can do that, all kinds of stuff.
For all two of you that still drink Rob Roys. So.
Hey, man. When you're drinking at home, you can use that nice scotch in a Rob Roy, and boy, it makes a difference.
It's true.
I got this bottle of Bunnahabhain.
Bunnahabhain makes amazing Rob Roys.
That's right. And if anybody wants the beautiful, I can get the recipe. I know the person that made this beautiful paella behind me. So the recipe, I can give you the terroir. Unfortunately, we can't.
All right. So for all things spirits and paella, spirits@bennies.com. Anything else, you can always hit us up on Facebook or whatever. Guys, thanks for joining us. Mike.
Hi, Mike.
Thanks for joining us, Mike.
Talk to you later. And everybody else, we'll keep an eye out. Hopefully next Monday, maybe the Monday after. Thanks for joining us tonight, and cheers. I'm going to enjoy the rest of my Carcavelos.
Cheers.
Exactly. Alicia, there's a good chance that these bottles are going to be gone by the time you get back to the office tomorrow.
Womp, womp. All right, guys. Have a good night, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.